Or is it good morning, everyone? Today we're going to speak about form and content appreciation. The topic for today is art criticism. It's our third lecture, right? Um, as I'd mentioned earlier, let's do a little research on the images that I have on the cover because they do have very good, these artists are really good at what they do. And what I try to focus on is contemporary artists specifically, or normally they tend to be from an African country, right, of African origin, even if they're not living within the continent. So, art criticism is, as I said, a very controversial topic from an African point of view or an African art lens. And I was speaking to a master's student today, and she was saying, yes, it's biased. It's literally biased, and we'll have a little discussion about that as we do the presentation. So today, this is the third slide. We're going to talk about several things. I'll try to be quick, and as I mentioned earlier, it is good for you guys to do your own investigation about art criticism because there's a whole lot of information about this one topic. But for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to tackle several things. One is we're going to define art criticism. We're going to discuss the role of art criticism. And then we'll look a little bit about the genesis of art criticism, which informs art history. And then we'll talk about art criticism from the lens of the African context, Islamic art criticism, as well as Chinese art criticism. Then we'll finish off with how to analyze art as a critique, right? So basically, the art of art criticism, right? And what you need to bear in mind are the classes we had before, where we were talking about formal analysis. You remember the 4 aspects of formal analysis, right? I hope you all remember the 4 aspects of formal analysis. So always bear those components in mind when you're doing art criticism. So a definition from the Encyclopedia of Britannica. Art criticism is the analysis and evaluation of works of art, so you were all right. And most subtly, art criticism is often tied to theory. It is, yes, interpretive. It involves the effort to understand a particular work of art from a theoretical perspective and to establish the significance in the history of art. So I think it's very self-explanatory. It is led by theory, and that's why when someone said it's a personal interpretation, it really isn't a personal interpretation. It's very much informed by the theory of art and, of course, art appreciation, which is what we've been discussing in this very lecture, right? So the role of art criticism, there are many, but I think from a bare minimum, you need to be a connoisseur. It's a French word that means a maestro, an expert. You need to be a connoisseur of art, right? And this means you must have a sound knowledge of the history of art, right? There's a gentleman called Philip Weisman who wrote in his essay, The Psychology of the Critique and the Psychological Criticism. This was in 1962. He said, the step from connoisseur to critique implies the progression from knowledge to judgment. So you see, when I was telling you it's actually informed, it's an informed context. You must be able to first understand things like elements of design, principles of design, appreciate how to do a formal analysis for you to give a good art criticism of any piece of artwork, right? So bear this in mind. Now, there are other roles of art criticism that I'll go into. The other one is that the critique must make judgment because the art dealt with is generally new and unfamiliar. So as you've noticed, as time goes, there's more and more artworks that are being, put forth in the universe by artists. And I guess as an art critique, you need to keep up with the times, right? So you need to understand which era are we living in, what genres are popular. I'd mentioned earlier Afrofuturism. I'd mentioned there's also something called neo-art. So the first image on this presentation by Evans Mbugua, who's a Kenyan painter, is in that era of pop, neo-pop art. And these are things you need to start reading, like sort of understanding things like the history of pop art for you to reflect on now what contemporary pop art looks like, right? So really, the critic is really challenged to make judgments or pass judgments, and correct ones at that, right? Then the other thing is the critic is often faced with choice. So there's usually a choice between defending the old standards, values, hierarchies against new ones, or you're actually looking at an art piece and you're defending the new against the old, right? So it's that back and forth. When you're looking at old artworks, you need to look at it in reflection. When you're looking at new artwork, you need to also reflect back. So it's a very reflective exercise that, and as time goes, I guess, and the better understanding we have of the artist, the better a critique you will become, right? Then finally, something that of course is a challenge is that sometimes you get artists who are really innovative, extremely innovative, right? So it's a really big task for an art critique to critique such work, work that looks mythological, magical, combined with several genres of art. Sometimes it's very difficult to critique when there's been layers and layers of genres piled up in an art piece. Perhaps the artist is using a very complex style, or perhaps it's so contemporary and new, like in the case of AI art. Sometimes you can't even tell a photograph, whether it's a photograph or whether it's AI generated. Have you guys encountered that issue? When you're looking at AI work, you're wondering, is this a photograph? Or is it AI? Or is it both? Or is it, so you keep so an art critique is, I guess because of technology and the advancement of it, it's becoming more and more difficult to actually do proper critique for artworks, particularly during this time. So I must say that today's or modern artists are really challenging the limits of the critiques in terms of understanding and appreciating the work that they're producing. And sometimes it forces critiques to fall back on established assumptions in intellectual and self-defeat. So I guess, if it's like the way, ukipitwa na wakati, like if your times, the older you are, sometimes you don't understand this generation, right? So that's how it is also with art criticism. You might be a good art critique, but sometimes you may face challenges because, you're looking at very contemporary modern design. Perhaps these are people who are, half or quarter your age, and you have to still make that criticism. And there's also the factor of technology, and that could also pose to be a very big challenge for art critiques. And I think this is very particular in this part of the world. How many of you have been on the roadside and you've been sold to art? Have you seen these guys walking with picture frames with art in them? Do you think they're genuine or do you think they're fakes? Have I preempted the answer? Do you think they're genuine? The guys who walk on the roadside, on the road, selling art pieces. Maybe they are, yes. I think, so the idea is sometimes they could be selling fake art. And it's very sad because when fake art simply means someone is plagiarizing someone's work, they've copied it from the internet, then they've just trimmed it. And that's really sad. So I guess as you go buying art, I remember my husband did this. He knew I loved art, African art as that. He went and bought a painting from the roadside. And then when I told him, oh, you know what, how much did you pay for it? He bought it for a considerable amount of money. But the unfortunate truth was it was a fake painting. It was, it looked like it was real brush strokes, but they weren't. It was a photocopy, for lack of a better word. It was a photocopy of someone else's painting. And that was really sad because you can imagine people who are perhaps not knowledgeable when it comes to analyzing art, they might make that mistake and buy fakes. And that happens to many people. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is you as designers need to also be very good at art critiquing because of such things that happen in the world. People creating fakes, people plagiarizing, people also passing off their work as someone else's, and so on and so forth. And there are many stories about this and cases in history about people who pass off as being, say, Picasso. You know, they publish their work and say they are called Picasso, and that work is just a copy of a style of Picasso's, and so on and so forth, right? So next page. So the genesis of art criticism, and here is where the controversy comes in. The genesis of art criticism is from a Western ideal. So, you know, when I say West, I mean Ngambo, the Americas, the Europes, right? So Western tradition has set the criteria, like the standard, the golden standard of evaluating art. And sometimes it may share with other cultures, but sometimes it could be unique, right? As well as there are elements of historiography, so the aspect of history in it, right? So within the history of Western art writing, there is a distinct critical tradition characterized by the use of theory, theoretical analysis of art in the West. And I guess that's what we're learning. We're learning, you know, elements of art and design, you know, line, color, form, shape, and so on and so forth. Those are Western standards. No African woke up and said, this is how you're meant to look at art, right? So I guess we're really basing it on the Western context. And it's made either to oppose or to defend contemporary approaches of art making, which has definitely led to this discipline that we're calling art criticism, right? So art criticism developed parallel to Western aesthetic theory, beginning with the very origins of Greek art, ancient Greek art, right? And it fully has formed, and it's informing art today, but it fully formed around the 18th and 19th century, right? So we really are using a Western lens to critique art to date, because I guess that's the only standard that has been set, and it's been going on for many centuries. So I guess it's for the world to adapt, conform, and use it as the golden standard, or it's for someone like you to wake up as a scholar and say, perhaps I'm interested in pursuing art criticism in a different way and mapping a standard for this. But for now, this is the standard we're using, which is what we'll embark on. So because there's been a lot of controversy around this Western ideal of how to do art criticism, many cultures have also said something about how their art should be critiqued. So I'll only talk about three because there are so many others, but I'll talk about three because they stand out as being a very interesting way of critiquing art outside just the Western model. So for African art criticism, I think the one thing that stands out is we have such a rich cultural context when we're going about doing art, right? So there's tradition, customs, spirituality embedded in our art, right? I think you see this. Whereas in the Western, they don't have really a lot of spirituality in them, or at least I haven't seen. They usually talk about lifestyle and and simple living, But for African art, you tend to see some of these traditional constructs coming into the fore. So, for example, African culture have evaluative traditions. They are often verbal, and I think this is usually informed by the oral storytelling that we see happening. And then, some of the work is really of a very different beauty than the Western one. And there's usually things like order, there's things like form, utilitarian qualities, I'll explain this, and the role it plays in communal and spiritual activities. So I'll give you an example. Like, the African masks, there are many types, right? So it's not just an art piece, like the way Westerns look at masks as an art piece. For them, it's meant to be on my wall, to decorate my wall. They wouldn't know the deeper meaning. In the African context, it's not just art. It's for, say, a circumcision ceremony, for example, right? So that specific mask is worn by the leader of the group that is going to be circumcised that year, for example. Or it could be a staff, a Cameroonian staff with the head of an elder, and perhaps it represents a certain tribe within that Cameroonian community, and that staff can only be held by a certain member of that specific community, and so on and so forth, right? So think about African art the way it really is woven with some traditional context. So I think this is what I'm talking about. So, so just to look at this picture that I have here, so you wouldn't call Dennis, he's called Dennis or Osadebe. He's actually Nigerian. So when you look at this artwork, you see very interesting, like, reflections of tradition and very contemporary constructs, right? I think you see that, right, in the art. So anyway, Dennis Osadebe depicts contemporary African life with vibrant hues. So modern day pop culture, neon green, bright purple, and so on and so forth. These are colors you may not necessarily see in the African tradition, but he uses it because his references are both pop aesthetic as well as he has this traditional Nigerian crafts look. Look at the suit. The suit has pattern, right? And that pattern is very West African. It's a simple print, but it's not something you'd say is Western. So there's a fusion of these two things happening, and I think it's because of his background. So he's Nigerian born, Lagos based, but he lives in a contemporary world. Because if you see, this is actually a 2017 art, pretty recent, and he's definitely been influenced by the things that are around him. And what he does is that he often composes his canvases digitally, then brings them to life with a bold palette of acrylic paint and archival pigments, right? So Osadebe, who is self-taught, studied business at university and turned to full-time art making shortly after graduation. He has since exhibited in Lagos, Cape Town, London, New York, Los Angeles. So Osadebe refers his style as Neo, N-E-O. He calls it Neo in reference to the Neo-Africa, which is the cultural movement that he coined as a collective to simplistic ideas about African art. Through his bright, positive, and provocative imagery, Osadebe hopes to embody his Neo-African ideals of presenting an evolving, multifaceted African art that transcends limiting Western conceptions. So are you seeing what I mean when I say the way you judge Western art is very different from the way you'd look at African art? Because African art has traditional evaluation points around it. Do you see what I'm trying to talk about? So it's not just about line, color, and it's also about what is it that is African that is not really necessarily something that is looked into when you're using the Western model. So this is where I'd like to bring up the controversy. So there's an argument by certain critics that art in the Western context can be defined originally as a physical reflection of the world. They'll normally, they'll have pictures of pop stars, Madonna, Rihanna, that for them is art. To them, that's art. But when you look at it, our art is slightly different because there's an emotive context around it. There's a traditional aesthetic around it. There's also spiritualism and things like that are also integrated, right? So also, when you're looking at how Western art is done, they normally create it and design it to put it on a wall, right? Mostly they'll put it on a wall, they'll put it in a museum, right? But if you look at African art, particularly for back in the day, most of it was used for ceremonies, right? It's called art, but it was really used for ceremonies. Look at these Masai Ushangas, the ones for weddings. Those ones are considered art in the West, but guess what? They're actually very, very important adornment for the Maasai community, and they're significant. Like, you can only wear that big ushanga with the many threads if you're a mother who's married and you're a mother of a child or something like that. So there's always these other things that are not factored in when you're looking at African art. So do you see the controversy? So a lady wrote and said, How can we categorize African art as art when it is neither intended to reflect the world physically, nor express emotion through aesthetics, nor be subjected to Western modes of display? And this lady is called Sarah Frisbee. She says, she's a curator in the North Carolina Museum of Art. She says, we simply can't. We can't call African art because it's really better than art. It's more than art. It's cultural, it's spiritual, it's religious, it has deeper meanings, it's used for a purpose, and so on and so forth. So do you understand what I mean? When I say art criticism from the Western lens is really controversial, right? So we'll stop there, and you can read a little bit more about African art criticism and the controversies thereof, and we can move on to the next slide. So the next slide is about, and that has been mislabeled. The next slide is meant to talk about Islamic art criticism. That's a mislabel right there. So Islamic culture have long tradition of historiographical writing about art. So who's a Muslim here? Who's from the Islamic culture? Okay, and yeah? So I think you do understand that also the way we would critique Islam is also quite different from the Western ideal. It's really led by historiographical writing. We could also say it's led by the culture, the Islam culture, right? I think you guys know how Islam culture doesn't, like, for example, revere or draw people often, particularly in art. But of course, modern day they've started doing it. But it's part of the culture. They normally use a lot of geometrical shapes and color. And perhaps I may be wrong. Because there's this construct of, and this is just something that I think is happening when it comes to Islam. They have this idea that we shouldn't really draw people or the human form because that is a form of idolizing the human form, right? There's that understanding around Islam. So anyway, but there's a lot of writing around this, and there's some referenced work here of a gentleman called Mustafa Ali, and I think the artist, 14th century, and 14th, 15th century, he actually has some works called Wonderful Deeds of the Artist. So I don't think I could get that work precisely, but I had something that was quite similar that demonstrates how Islam art criticism is also a little bit different. So they focus on the decorative traditions, and it's really hinged around Islam. They also focus on calligraphy, the stylized writing, which is, I think you know calligraphy as being a cursive sort of handwriting, very special. When they're writing their Arabic notes. Then there's also woodwork, as well as glassware, metalworks, and textiles that define the Islamic art. So their art is also very different, and also usually is to serve a certain purpose. And therefore, perhaps you should also think about, when you're critiquing their work, look at it slightly different from the Western one. Then finally, we'll talk about the Chinese art criticism, or the Chinese art. So China has a long tradition, and a strong one at that, of art evaluation. It dates back to writers such as He He, who was active during the mid-16th century. And he's very well known for the 6 principles he put forth that guide how Chinese art would be represented and would be the ideal form of painting, right? So a major principle was Qi Yang She Dong, which means spirit resonance and life motion. And also there was another construct called Lirati, who wrote and also there was someone who wrote about biographies of these great artists. So he proposes six principles, and I'll tell you what those 6 principles are, because they're also different from what the Western art criticism construct is all about. If you go to the next page, you will see what these principles are. The first one is about creativity, and this is the most important, right? And this is what is called spirit resonance. Can you relate? Is there a divinity around it? Because that's sort of where the talent from the artist comes from. So that innate talent from the artist needs to be shown. I think in modern day we call it what's your signature style, in short, right? So creativity is the first principle. Then there's structure, use of the brush, because as you know, the Chinese paint a lot with the brush, and they actually design these brushes with bamboo and and whatnot. And then there's also proper representation of objects. They have a big thing around proportions, like when you're drawing the human form, make it look proportional, don't make it distorted. They're perfectionists when it comes to doing art. And then they also look at specific coloration of those objects. um, they hold certain colors in their culture in high regard, such as red. Red is such a spiritual color to them, and you'll always see it in their art. And then, of course, the general good composition, which, of course, is informed by the elements and principles of art and design, line, color, form, value, etc. Then the final one is transmission of the old masters by copying them. So they really upheld teaching by copying, because if you could be able to do what your master could do, you are, to the very letter, like you could even pass off your work to be someone else's, the master's work, then you really were good at it. And I think up to today, we normally do that. In art, we usually learn how to do, for example, portraiture by learning from masters, or who've understood anatomy and so on and so forth. So the idea of copying a master is something that still is also used in modern day constructs. But for them, it's one of the principles that they uphold. So if you look at someone's art, you will see that it's very repetitive. Even if they're doing different series of arts, and they'll always have a similar style. It's like they won't go away from that style. It's always the same style. So these are the 6 principles or basic standards of both Chinese painting, training, as well as critic judgment. Now, if you look at that picture, I'll just let you look at it. It's a very famous painting by a gentleman called Chang Hyo, and he's Chinese, of course. The series is 4 images of 4 beautiful women. It's called Famous 4 Beauties. It's hand painted on a Chinese rice paper. And if you just reflect back on the 6 principles, you'll see what I mean, right? He literally is a master at adhering to the 6 principles. Analyzing art. And how we're going to do this is I'll just first list them, and then please pay attention, because this is essentially how to do, critiquing. So it's very similar to how you do a visual analysis, but it's a lot more, right? So that's the only difference. So art criticism is very synonymous to visual analysis, but it's so much more, right? So you first describe by answering the question, what do you see? You'll secondly analyze by answering the question, how did the artist do it? You'll then ask yourself, what are the principles and elements of art? By reflecting upon the art form. Remember form, what we described as form. And then you will interpret it by answering the questions, and then normally 2, what is the artist trying to say or convey, and what is going on in the picture. So those are in principle, 4 things that you need to look into. However, there's so much more about each. So I'll just quickly again run through them so that you're able to understand each pillar, because it's so much more than what is being highlighted here. So for description, number 1, you'll ask yourself, just by your own judgment, purely describe the object without value judgment. So don't judge, just ask yourself, what is it that I am seeing? And then list what you see in the artwork. Look at the objects, the figures, the colors, look at the shapes, the background. Imagine you're describing it to a person who is not with you. So when you're describing it, always make sure that it's like the person is looking at it, but they're not with you. So you need to be you almost need to over elaborate what it is you're seeing. Do it in as much detail as possible, and remember to use art terms. So that's what description is. I hope it's clear. The second part, which is analysis, is how did the artist go about doing it? So here, you determine what the features suggest and decide why the artist used such features to convey specific ideas. So for this instance, you're looking at the composition, basically how the elements on the artwork are organized or arranged, the shapes are organized. You also look at what those types of shapes are. So for example, you'll be like, it's curved, it's rounded, it's straight edged, or they're geometrical shapes, and so on. You'll also ask yourself, is there a mixture of different types of shapes? Or are there shapes that seem similar? There are also some parts of the composition full of shapes and some parts empty, or are the shapes spread evenly across the artwork? So you'll sort of pan your eye across the whole canvas and look at everything and describe it according to just making a visual analysis of what's going on. Ask yourself also questions like, are some shapes repeated or echoed in other parts of the artwork? Does the work composition look full of energy and movement, or does it look still and peaceful? How did the artist create this movement or stillness? Then finally, you'll ask yourself, what is the center of interest in the composition, as well as how does the artist draw your attention to it? So that is what analysis is. I think there is a whole lot. Then for the principles of elements in art, you will reflect upon the subject matter. So through the naming iconographic elements, or you'd look at the year, these are the historical events that were happening around that time. You look at the allegory, you will look at some of the genres of art. Perhaps you'd say this is, impressionist or post-impressionist, or it's mythology and spirituality and so on and so forth. So that's essentially looking at some of the reflections on art form. You'll also select the most distinctive features or characteristics. So is this person using lines? Is this person using color in a certain way? Or texture, and so on and so forth. You'll also analyze, wow, it's a lot. So you'll also analyze the use of light and the role of color. Look at also things like, treatment of space and landscape, both real and illusions, portrayal of movement and how it was achieved, effect of particular mediums, your perception of balance, proportion, and shapes, and of course, reaction to objects or the monument or installation or whatever. So so elements and principles of art are many, and I guess that's why these pointers are a lot of them. So basically, look at what principles and elements of art are and infuse it to inform your art criticism. Then finally, for interpretation, this is where I keep speaking about informed judgment. Interpretation answers the question, what is the artist trying to say and what is going on in the picture? What do you think the artist is trying to say in this artwork? So you will ask yourself such a question. You also say, what does it mean? What is the main theme? You'll also look at the work and ask yourself, what do you feel? Because feeling is also part of art criticism. You also look at it and ask yourself, does the artwork have a narrative? Like, does it tell a story? Is it a religious art piece? Is it abstract? Is it realistic? Why? And so on and so forth. And then finally, how would you explain this artwork to someone else? Because that's, I guess, the point of evaluation, where you say, this artwork shows X, right? So X could be after you've done all this description, analysis, and interpretation. So, and I think one other thing is that you can also think about when you're doing art criticism is to look at the evidence inside or outside the artwork that supports your interpretation. You remember what I was trying to tell you, that you need to look at the year it was created, because those are hints, the name of the artist, find out, is he French, is he African, if he's African, what ancestry, and so on and so forth. And even if you're looking at the year, look at the times they were living in around that time, and also things like also the medium, why that medium? Why did they use bronze? Why did they use silver or gold foil and so on and so forth? Is there something significant about that material and so on and so forth? So use evidence that you also see to make your interpretation, right? So is it easy to do art criticism? It is. So expect, like, if I give you one piece and I tell you to write 3 pages about that one art piece, yes, you're able to do it. So that's what art criticism is. So we're going to have a go, and that's what I'm saying. It is really now beyond visual analysis. It's more than visual analysis, because now here you're making an intellectual judgment over the art piece. So we'll have a look at one art piece that is really a timeless art piece. I'd like to own this art piece. I don't know whether it's my craze around having or owning a nude, but anyway, this is an art piece by a gentleman called Marcel Duchamp. So Duchamp was a French artist who lived around the modernist era, that is the 1900s and 1980s. So 1900s, yes, 1900s, 1980s. So anyway, so there's something about that time. Modernist art was around that time, and there was a lot of movements around that time. So the specific genre of the time was Surrealism and Dadaism. I'd suggest you actually go and read about those 2 genres. So there's a genre called Surrealism and Dadaism, and I guess just by the names, I'm sure you can tell it's very abstract, right? It's an abstract. They were abstract forms of art. Like, people were now moving. Why it was called modernist is people were now moving from representational art, like drawing what you see, which is what we see mostly in this continent. Like, you draw a lion the way the lion looks. Moving away from representational art, and they were now evolving to drawing in very abstract forms. So this art piece is called The Nude Descending a Staircase number 2. It was actually painted in 1912, and it was done in oil on canvas. And currently it's hanging in the Museum of Philadelphia, Museum of Art, right? So I'd like to just say that Duchamp was celebrated, like he was a big deal. Just like the way Picasso is a big deal. He was really well celebrated. He also wrote a lot about art during that time. Now, just by viewing the art, I think you can tell it's someone walking down the stairs, right? That's the subject matter. And what the artist was trying to explore was the process of abstraction. That is the simplification and rearrangement of elements of art to create images that look less like the object on which they are based, although they may still be recognizable. And that's why I say it's very abstract, because that's what abstract art looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read to you what the critiques of that day said about the artwork, right? So that you actually have an appreciation of why he was so in vogue. In fact, apparently, when he exhibited, his work was so different from everyone else's. Everyone was just like thrown off. They were thrown aback at this very piece, because everyone else who was exhibiting around him was really sort of just painting what people would see normally, representational art. You show a woman who's perhaps walking on the street with an umbrella, or people seated by a meadow, having a picnic. That was what was being represented during the day. Very normal, basic. You could actually just at a glance tell what was going on. But for this one, it's like you needed to move closer to find out what was going on. So I'll just read what the critics said. So they said, Duchamp's paintings captured widespread attention for its unconventional rendition of the nude. So definitely this was a nude, but it was really depicted differently. He positioned the figure, figure, its upright stance iterative by the vertical orientation of the canvas, which was quite different because what he did is that he made canvases were normally painted on in horizontal format. He reoriented it and put it in portrait, which was quite different and unique during the time, right? And if you look, there's a descending diagonal form that comes from the upper left to the lower corner of this form. And there's a tangle of shattered geometrical shapes, suggesting that the stairs in the lower left corner of the composition, while the rows of receding stairs at the upper left and right frame um, that are strangely multiplying female form is descending on. So you can clearly see their staircases just by looking at the top right and the bottom left, and you can see this figure. So you don't know whether it's one or many, but the idea is you can see a female form. And I think we can conclude it was female form because during that time, I mean, no one used to do nudes of gentlemen. So the nudes that used to be drawn were female nudes, right? So, and you can even see based on the line, like the curve of the hip, you can tell it's a feminine form. I don't think this form would pass off as a gentleman's form. So anyway, going on. But what a descent, right? So it was really an interesting descent because there was also repetition. Do you see the repetition? Like it was an echo. Like this form is being repeated. Um, like we're showing the different ways she was walking down the stairs, right? And the figure, so this is one critic who says, the figure recalls the whirling of a robot promenading down a set of stairs as if in some sort of futuristic movie. Or perhaps a magic lantern show, a popular form of image projection in the years before the development of cinema. So I think this just goes to, they're just being descriptive in and putting things in context during the time. When you swing a lantern, when you swing a lantern, see your shadow also. There's a way that movement is very sort of rhythmic, right? So the same way the nude has been represented in a very rhythmic form, like the way a lantern would be, or the way a robot would be, walking like in a robotic manner. That's how this nude has been presented along the staircase. And then Henry Duchamp's subject matter is nearly indecipherable. His figure registers as female because of the convention. And I've said this, at least in the recent years, expects most nudes in art to be women. So I've already explained that. Its relatively monochromatic palette of warm browns and ochre, subtly tinged with a grayish green, blue-green, is typical of early Cubist paintings by Pablo Picasso and George Braque, who had wanted to minimize the optical effects of color and emphasis, instead a revolutionary new conception of space. So what happened was his work transcends just surrealism and Dadaism. It now moves into a new emerging genre called Cubism, which was really revered at the time, and it was started by two gentlemen, Georges Braque and Picasso. So I guess when you look at Duchamp's work, you see that he broke away from the typical modernist way of doing art and now entered a new abstract form of doing art that at the time might have thrown people back, but it evolved and it's what we see now today as Cubism. So we can say he was the intersection of um, the art for before, that is modernist from before, and now he's moving into modern art, right? Proper, which is the Cubism that we really celebrate. So I think I'll leave it there because I don't also want to over-explain. And I'll allow or give room for questions. But before I give you an opportunity to ask any questions, I'd like you to appreciate that I have left a list of references on the bibliography section. Please have a read on some of the material here. It is important for you to just get a deeper understanding of what we've just discussed today. Now, on the last page, I'd like you to have a look at something. So, as I'd mentioned earlier, and I think in my first class, my second class, I always want to put an African lens to each class simply because there's very little classwork that is informed by African art. Like most people will bear all their lectures, or most topics usually use examples from the West. So it's always nice to also look at African examples. Now, this is a very interesting art piece by a lady called Esther Mahlangu. She is actually Ndebele, originally from South Africa. And if you look at the top picture, you will see she is she's an elderly woman. I guess, you know, so it just goes to show you that traditions are still being, you know, I guess the idea of traditional art is fading because it's now the older generation who still remember or still have the knowledge to do traditional art. So I think if you look at Ndebele art, it's very colorful. They even color their houses, their homes, they color their artifacts. And so what this lady has done is that she's extremely famous. And I'll tell you how. So first, I'll give you a little history about her. Esther Mahlangu was born in November 11th, 1935, so she's not young. She's a South African artist, and she's known for the bold, large-scale, the contemporary paintings that you see on this page. And all of it is referenced from her Ndebele heritage. She is one of South Africa's best-known artists, and Mahlangu's art references patterns found in clothing and the jewelry of the Ndebele, like what you see she's wearing. I don't know if you see what she's wearing. And the patterns she uses are typically very colorful and geometric. Her paintings are large in scale, and she uses brushes made from chicken feathers. So her painting, all that you're seeing, she makes her own brushes and uses the chicken feathers to do the painting. She's known for translating and substituting the traditional surfaces for Ndebele mural art. She does a lot of cow dung walls. Also, she works with canvas, and eventually also she started doing metal alloys. So one of the interesting things about her is in 1991, she was commissioned, imagine, by BMW. Go read about her, to create an art car. And what happened is she was just one of the many. Like every year, there's usually this huge exhibition that BMW do, and they do a showpiece by an artist. So you can imagine they'd commission the likes of Andy Warhol. I don't know if you guys know one of the greatest pop artists called Andy Warhol. Most of your works here I've seen are very influenced by this artist called Andy Warhol. So anyway, Andy Warhol has done an art car for BMW, David Hockney, the likes of Frank Stella, and so on and so forth. So for her, the car she was given was the BMW 525i, and she was the first African to actually be given the privilege of painting the exterior and the interior. I mean, if you go look at that car, I'd love to own that car. The dashboard has this Ndebele colorful print, etc, etc. So, and she painted it with the typical Ndebele motifs. The car was later exhibited at the National Museum of Women in Arts in Washington, D.C. in 1994, and also was exhibited at the British Museum in London in 1927. Isn't her works wonderful? And they're traditional. They're based on traditional art. So that sums the end of this class. Thank you.